A cop pulls over an elderly black man in a luxury car, convinced it's stolen. His harsh accusations lead to an arrest, and the man's chilling parting words, "You'll regret this," haunt him all night. But when the officer walks into work the next morning, everything changes. That man isn't just a suspect, he's the new deputy chief assigned to reform the department. What happens when the tables are turned and justice comes knocking? This is a story about reckoning, redemption, and the power of second chances you won't want to miss. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The night air hung heavy with late summer humidity as Officer Ben Mathers drummed his fingers on his patrol car's steering wheel. The outskirts of town were usually quiet at this hour, just the way he liked it. The soft glow of his dashboard lights and occasional passing headlights kept him company. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him as he fought off the monotony of another late-night patrol. That's when he noticed it. A sleek black Mercedes S-Class weaving ever so slightly across the center line. Ben's jaw tightened. Something wasn't right about this picture. The expensive car seemed out of place on this rural stretch of road, especially at this hour. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered, flicking on his patrol lights. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, coming to a stop on the shoulder, tires crunching softly on the gravel. Ben approached the driver's side window, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The window rolled down with a soft whir, revealing an elderly black man in an expensive-looking suit. The man's calm demeanor only made Ben more suspicious. The interior of the car smelled of leather and subtle cologne. "License and registration," Ben demanded, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. His flashlight beam swept across the luxury interior, lingering on the wood trim and pristine dashboard. "Of course, officer." The man's voice was steady and dignified as he reached for his documents. "I'm Arthur Coleman. Is there a problem?" His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he retrieved his wallet from his breast pocket. Ben snatched the papers, studying them with narrowed eyes. Everything matched. The registration, the license, all of it. But something in his gut told him this couldn't be right. The photo matched, the address was local, yet suspicion gnawed at him. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Ben ordered, his hand resting on his belt. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of his handcuffs. "May I ask why?" Arthur's tone remained measured, but his eyes held a hint of weariness, as if he'd been through this before. The streetlight above cast shadows across his face. "Because I said so," Ben snapped. "This vehicle was reported stolen." It was a lie, but Ben was certain there had to be something illegal going on here. No way this man could afford a car like this legitimately, he thought. "That's not possible, officer. I've owned this car for 3 years. Arthur's calm explanation only fueled Ben's frustration. The man's composure felt like a challenge. "Out! Now!" Ben's voice grew harder as he opened the driver's door. The hinges purred smoothly, betraying the car's quality engineering. Arthur slowly emerged, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He stood tall, despite his age, dignity intact. "Officer Mathers, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a mistake." His polished shoes gleamed in the patrol car's headlights. "Hands behind your back," Ben commanded, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for suspected vehicle theft and resisting an officer." The metal clinked as he readied them. "I haven't resisted anything," Arthur stated quietly as the cuffs clicked into place. "And you know that." His suit jacket wrinkled as Ben secured his wrists. Ben roughly guided Arthur toward the patrol car, ignoring the older man's composed protests. Just before Ben placed him in the back seat, Arthur turned his head slightly. A cricket chirped in the darkness, the only witness to their encounter. "You'll regret this," he said softly, no threat in his voice, just certainty. The words seemed to hang in the humid night air. The words sent an unexpected chill down Ben's spine, but he pushed the feeling aside. "Save it for the judge," he muttered, closing the door with more force than necessary. The sound echoed across the empty road. As Ben slid behind the wheel, he caught Arthur's reflection in his rearview mirror. The man sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Something about that steadiness made Ben's victory feel hollow, but he pushed the thought away. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? The drive to the precinct stretched before them, filled with an uncomfortable silence that even the radio couldn't break. Streetlights swept across them rhythmically, marking time in their tense journey. Ben strutted into the precinct the next morning, a swagger in his step. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he made his way to the conference room, nodding at fellow officers. He'd done his job last night, protected the community from suspicious activity. That's what good police work was all about, wasn't it? He could still picture the satisfaction on his partner's face when they'd wrapped up the arrest. The conference room filled quickly with the morning shift officers, their chairs scraping against the linoleum floor. Ben settled into his usual spot near the back, coffee cup warming his hands. A few officers chatted in hushed tones around him, sharing stories from their night patrols. Captain Diane Lopez stood at the front, her crisp uniform and straight posture commanding attention. Her dark eyes scanned the room with practiced authority. "Good morning, everyone," Captain Lopez began, her voice firm and clear. "Before we begin our daily briefing, I'd like to introduce someone important." She gestured to the door, a slight smile playing at her lips. Ben's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Walking into the room was Arthur Coleman, the man he'd arrested just hours ago. But now Arthur wore an impeccable charcoal suit, his badge gleaming on his belt. His presence filled the room with an unmistakable air of authority. "Please welcome our new Deputy Chief of Police, Arthur Coleman," Captain Lopez announced, pride evident in her voice. "He comes to us with an exemplary record and will be heading our department's conduct reform initiative." The room fell silent. Ben's throat went dry as Arthur's eyes found his. A knowing smile played at the corners of Arthur's mouth, and Ben felt his stomach twist into knots. "Thank you, Captain Lopez," Arthur said smoothly, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "In fact, I've already had a chance to experience our department's current approach to community policing. Just last night I was pulled over by one of your officers." He paused, his gaze still fixed on Ben. It was illuminating. After the meeting, Ben's heart pounded like a drum as he followed Arthur into his new office. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, catching the nameplate that already read Deputy Chief Coleman in fresh gold lettering. "Have a seat, Officer Mathers," Arthur said, gesturing to a chair while settling into his own leather seat. Ben remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "Sir, about last night." "Last night showed me exactly why I'm needed here," Arthur interrupted calmly, studying Ben's face. "Which is why you're going to be my first project." "Project?" Ben's face flushed hot, anger rising in his chest like a tide. "I'm assigning you to my personal mentorship program. We'll be working closely together over the next few months. Consider it an opportunity to broaden your perspective." "This is ridiculous," Ben sputtered, his voice rising. "You can't—" "I can, and I am." Arthur's voice remained level, but his eyes held steel. "This isn't punishment, Officer Mathers. It's an opportunity for growth." "Growth," Ben scoffed, his hands trembling with fury. "This is revenge." Arthur leaned forward, folding his hands on his polished desk. "Change begins with discomfort, Officer Mathers. And from what I've seen, there's plenty of room for change." Rage bubbled in Ben's chest, threatening to boil over. Without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the frame. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he marched away, his mind already racing with ways to get out of this situation. Other officers quickly stepped aside as he passed, sensing the storm cloud of his anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He'd make sure of that. Ben stood outside Arthur's office at 2 p.m. sharp, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. He'd spent the morning fuming at his desk, barely able to focus on paperwork, the coffee in his cup going cold and bitter. Now here he was, forced into this ridiculous mentorship program like some rookie fresh out of the academy. He knocked harder than necessary, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. "Come in, Officer Mathers," Arthur's steady voice called out, as unruffled as ever. Ben entered to find Arthur sitting behind his desk, a thick manila folder open in front of him. Ben recognized it immediately, his personnel file. The sight of it made his chest tighten with defensive anger. "Please have a seat," Arthur gestured to the chair across from him, his weathered hands folded carefully over the papers. Ben dropped into it, arms crossed over his chest like a shield. "I've been reviewing your record," Arthur began, flipping through pages with methodical precision. "There's quite a pattern here. 7 complaints of racial profiling in the past year alone, 3 excessive force allegations, multiple citations for aggressive behavior during routine stops." The paper whispered accusingly as he turned each page. "Those complaints were unfounded," Ben shot back, his fingers digging into his biceps. "People file complaints when they're angry about getting caught. It's that simple." Arthur raised an eyebrow, the gesture somehow both gentle and challenging. "Every single one? That's quite a coincidence." He pulled out several sheets, laying them on the desk with deliberate care. "Let's look at last month's incident with Mr. Rodriguez. You pulled him over for a broken taillight, but ended up searching his entire vehicle without consent." "He was acting suspicious," Ben defended, the words tasting stale in his mouth. "By speaking Spanish to his daughter?" Arthur's voice remained maddeningly calm, each word measured and precise. "Or was it the rosary hanging from his mirror that triggered your instincts?" Ben's face burned hot with shame and anger. "You weren't there. You don't know—" "I know enough," Arthur interrupted gently, raising a hand. "Your first assignment is to review every complaint filed against you in the past year. I want detailed reports explaining your decisions in each case. What led to your actions? What assumptions did you make? What could you have done differently?" "This is a waste of time," Ben growled, his fingers flexing against his arms. Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying Ben thoughtfully, his dark eyes holding decades of experience. "You remind me of another young officer I knew years ago. So certain he was right, so resistant to examining his own biases. His unchecked prejudices eventually cost him everything: his badge, his reputation, his future." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'd hate to see history repeat itself." The cryptic comment made Ben's stomach twist with an uncomfortable mix of fear and defiance, but he refused to show it. Instead, he pushed back from the desk, chair legs scraping harshly against the floor. "Fine, I'll do your little homework assignment, but don't expect me to play along with this reform fantasy of yours." Without waiting for a response, Ben stalked out of the office, letting the door bang shut behind him with enough force to rattle the frosted glass window. The morning sun filtered through the patrol car's windshield as Ben gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, perfectly composed in his pressed uniform, hands folded neatly in his lap, the picture of calm authority. "I usually start my patrol route through the east side," Ben said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge, almost daring Arthur to object. "There's more activity there, especially around the housing projects. Always something going down." Arthur nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "And why do you prefer that area?" "Higher crime rates, more arrests," Ben replied quickly, defensive pride creeping into his tone, then added, "It's just statistics. The numbers don't lie." "Statistics can tell many stories depending on who's interpreting them," Arthur said softly, wisdom coating each word. He gazed out the window as they drove past a small park where children were playing on brightly colored equipment, their laughter carrying through the morning air. "Pull over here." Ben hesitated but complied, easing the patrol car to the curb. A young man was arguing with a store owner outside a convenience store, their raised voices carrying across the street. Ben reached instinctively for his door handle, but Arthur held up his hand, firm but gentle. "I'll take this one. Watch carefully and try to see beyond your first instinct." Ben crossed his arms and observed as Arthur approached the situation, his frustration evident in his rigid posture. Instead of immediately asserting authority, Arthur stood at a comfortable distance, his posture relaxed and unthreatening, showing no sign of the tension crackling in the air. "Good morning, gentlemen," Arthur called out warmly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly. "Seems like you're having some difficulty. Mind if I help sort things out?" The young man had accidentally knocked over a display while reaching for something on a high shelf, and the store owner wanted him to pay for damaged items. Within minutes, Arthur had negotiated a compromise that left both parties satisfied. The young man would help clean up and pay for only the items that couldn't be resold, while the store owner would get some much-needed help reorganizing his display. Back in the car, Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. That could have escalated quickly. Sometimes you need to show more authority. Let them know who's in charge. Arthur was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. Let me tell you something, Ben. When I was 22, I was pulled over 3 times in 1 week. Same route, same time, different officers. Each time they insisted my car must be stolen. He turned to face Ben directly, his gaze steady and unwavering. One officer made me lie face down on the pavement while he ran my plates. I was wearing a suit, heading to law school classes, my textbooks scattered across the ground. Ben's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his fingers ached. That was different. It was a different time. Things aren't like that anymore. Was it? Arthur asked quietly, his words heavy with meaning. When you pulled me over 2 nights ago, what was different? The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Ben stared straight ahead, his jaw working as he ground his teeth. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but Arthur's story had struck something deep inside him, a truth he wasn't ready to face, but one that demanded attention. At the precinct later, Ben sat at his desk, the stack of his old case files looming before him like an accusation. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the first folder, the pages crackling with age. As he read through his own reports, patterns began to emerge, patterns he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. His stomach churned with a mixture of denial and dawning realization, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on his shoulders. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Arthur's office window, as Ben shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming restlessly against his thigh. Arthur sat behind his dark wooden desk, his presence as steady as always, though something in his expression had softened like a teacher preparing to share an important lesson. Let me tell you about March 15, 1982, Arthur began, his deep voice carrying a weight Ben hadn't heard before, each word measured and deliberate. I was driving home from my first year of law school. Brand new suit, briefcase my mother had saved up to buy me. Worked double shifts for 3 months to get it. I was proud, feeling like I was finally becoming somebody, like I was living up to everything my family had sacrificed. Ben crossed his arms, trying to maintain his defensive posture, but something in Arthur's tone made him listen. The usual hardness in his jaw began to slack, ever so slightly. 2 officers pulled me over, no reason given. Before I knew it, I was face down on the pavement, my new suit covered in dirt, that briefcase thrown open with my papers scattered everywhere in the wind. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on Ben, not accusatory but unflinching. They said I matched the description of a robbery suspect. Funny thing was, the suspect they were looking for was half my height and twice my age. They didn't even apologize when they figured out their mistake. That was 40 years ago, Ben interrupted, his voice sharp but uncertain, a tremor of doubt creeping in. Things are different now. We have body cams, oversight committees. Are they? Arthur asked quietly, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. When you pulled me over the other night, what description was I matching? What threat did you see in a 65-year-old man in a department-issued vehicle? Ben's face flushed deep red. You're trying to manipulate me with these stories. Where are the facts, the statistics you're so fond of citing? Raw data doesn't lie. Behind every statistic is a human story, Officer Mathers. Arthur leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light. Why do these stories make you so uncomfortable? What are you afraid of seeing in them, or perhaps in yourself? Ben stood up abruptly, pacing the small office like a caged animal. His footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm just tired of everything being turned into a lesson about bias. Every traffic stop, every arrest, it's exhausting. Tomorrow afternoon, Arthur said, changing the subject smoothly, his tone brooking no argument. There's a community outreach event at the Jefferson Community Center. You'll be joining me." "What? No, I have patrol." "Your schedule has been adjusted," Arthur cut in firmly, but not unkindly. "Sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zones to see the whole picture. The community's perspective on law enforcement might surprise you. You might even learn something about yourself." Ben ran a hand through his hair in frustration, mussing it up. "Fine. Whatever you say, Deputy Chief." As Ben reached for the door handle, Arthur's voice stopped him. "That day in 1982 could have broken me, Officer Mathers. Instead, it showed me exactly why I needed to finish law school. Sometimes our worst moments light the way forward." Ben paused, his hand still on the door. Despite his resistance, questions about Arthur's past began forming in his mind, along with an unwanted curiosity about how it connected to his own actions. The weight of unspoken parallels hung heavy in the air between them. Ben slumped in his worn leather chair, surrounded by stacks of case files spread across his small apartment desk. The lamp cast a harsh yellow light over the papers, making his eyes strain as he flipped through report after report. Empty coffee cups littered the desk's surface, evidence of his hours-long review session. A half-eaten sandwich sat forgotten on a paper plate, the bread curling at the edges. His fingers traced over his own handwriting in the reports, the blue ink smudged in places from his left-handed grip. Words like suspicious behavior and matched the profile jumped out at him, accusations in permanent ink. Each case file told a similar story: traffic stops, searches, arrests. Most involved minorities. The patterns were becoming harder to ignore, like puzzle pieces fitting together to form an uncomfortable picture. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pushing away from the desk with enough force to make his chair wheels squeak against the hardwood floor. But his eyes caught on a photo clipped to one file. A young black man being handcuffed, his expression a mix of fear and resignation. The streetlight in the background cast shadows across the man's face, and something about it transported Ben back 25 years. He was 11 again, watching police officers lead his mother away in handcuffs. The memory hit him like a physical blow, her tearful face, the neighbors watching from their windows, the shame burning in his chest. She'd only stolen food and basic supplies, desperate to provide for him after losing her job at the factory. But the officer had shown no mercy, roughly shoving her into the patrol car despite her pleas, despite her explanation about her hungry child waiting at home. 2 weeks later, they were evicted. Ben remembered packing his few belongings into garbage bags, no longer able to afford their small apartment on the outskirts of town. The sound of tape ripping as he sealed those bags still echoed in his mind. "Damn you, Arthur," Ben growled, yanking open his laptop with trembling hands. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he opened a new document. The cursor blinked accusingly as he began typing, each keystroke harder than necessary. "Formal complaint, Deputy Chief Arthur Coleman. Retargeted harassment and abuse of authority." But the words wouldn't flow. Ben backspaced aggressively, trying different approaches, his frustration growing with each failed attempt. Each attempt to articulate his grievances felt hollow, like he was grasping at smoke, the words dissolving before they could form anything substantial. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if she were standing beside him. "Baby, you've got to be better than them. Don't let the anger win." She'd told him that during their last visit, before pneumonia took her in prison. Ben's gaze drifted back to the case files, spread out like playing cards in a losing hand. The faces in the photos seemed to stare back at him. People he'd stopped, searched, arrested. Had he given them the same treatment that officer had given his mother? The thought made his stomach churn, acid rising in his throat. The complaint document remained mostly blank on his screen, save for the header. Ben's fingers rested motionless on the keyboard as doubt crept in, casting shadows over his certainty. The anger was still there, hot and familiar, but now it felt directionless, tangled up with something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. The night grew deeper, and still he sat there, caught between the past he couldn't change and a future he wasn't sure how to face. Ben stood awkwardly near the community center's entrance, watching Arthur work the room with natural grace. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as voices echoed through the crowded space, mixing with the soft shuffling of chairs and occasional bursts of laughter. Colorful posters about community engagement decorated the walls, their bold messages about unity and understanding making Ben feel even more out of place in his crisp uniform. "Welcome, everyone," Arthur's warm voice carried across the room, commanding attention without demanding it. "We're here to listen and learn from each other. Every voice matters in this space." Ben crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, trying to become invisible among the potted plants and bulletin boards. He watched as Arthur moved from group to group, sitting down with families, listening intently to their stories, nodding at just the right moments. The genuine concern on Arthur's face made Ben's stomach twist uncomfortably, reminding him of conversations he'd avoided. "Officer Mathers?" A gentle voice caught his attention. Ben turned to see an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes approaching him, her floral dress swaying as she walked. "I'm Mrs. Thompson. You probably don't remember me." Ben shifted his weight, preparing for another complaint, his fingers drumming against his arm. "No, ma'am, I'm sorry I don't." "You helped my grandson Marcus last month," she said, her eyes welling up with tears that caught the harsh overhead light. "Instead of arresting him for that shoplifting incident, you took the time to talk to him. Got him into that youth program." She reached out and squeezed his arm, her touch warm and grateful. "He's doing so much better now. Not many officers would have shown that kind of compassion." Ben blinked, the memory slowly returning like a photograph coming into focus. The kid had reminded him of himself at that age, angry, scared, acting out. I'm glad he's doing better," he managed to say, his voice rougher than he intended. Arthur appeared beside them, placing a gentle hand on Mrs. Thompson's shoulder, his presence both commanding and comforting. "That's exactly the kind of policing we need more of," he said softly, his words carrying weight without judgment. "When we lead with understanding instead of judgment, we create real change, one interaction at a time." Ben felt his face grow hot, the flush creeping up his neck. He couldn't reconcile Arthur's praise with the anger he'd been holding onto, like trying to fit together pieces from different puzzles. The sincerity in Mrs. Thompson's gratitude made his chest tight with emotion he didn't want to examine, feelings he'd pushed down for too long. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the deepest impressions," Arthur continued, his eyes meeting Ben's with quiet understanding. "They remind people that behind the badge, we're all human, trying to make this community better, one day at a time." Ben watched as more residents approached Arthur sharing their stories, some painful, some hopeful, each one a thread in the community's fabric. The genuine connection he witnessed made his usual defensive stance feel heavy and unnecessary, like armor he no longer needed to wear. As the event continued into the evening, Ben found himself listening more, his crossed arms gradually falling to his sides, tension melting from his shoulders. Each story chipped away at the wall he'd built around himself, leaving him increasingly uncertain about the beliefs he'd held so firmly, like shadows disappearing in the light of day. The precinct conference room buzzed with nervous energy as officers filed in for Arthur's mandatory workshop. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across uncomfortable faces, highlighting the tension in the room. Coffee cups clutched like shields. Some officers whispered among themselves while others stared straight ahead. Ben slumped in his chair near the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest, projecting an air of defiance. "Good morning, everyone," Arthur began, his calm voice filling the room. He stood at the front with quiet confidence, his pressed suit and gentle demeanor, a stark contrast to the uniformed officers before him. "Today we're discussing ethical decision-making in the field. I'd like each of you to share a challenging situation you've faced." Several officers shared their stories: domestic disputes, mental health calls, traffic stops gone wrong. Each narrative revealed the complex reality of their daily work. Arthur listened intently, offering thoughtful feedback on how each situation could have been handled differently, his suggestions practical and rooted in experience. "Officer Mathers," Arthur said, his eyes finding Ben's. His tone was inviting, not confrontational. "Would you share an example with us?" Ben straightened in his chair, feeling every eye in the room turn to him. The sudden attention made his neck prickle with sweat. "Fine," he said, clearing his throat. "Last month, I caught a kid stealing from Miller's Market. Textbook arrest, he had the merchandise on him, tried to run." "And what was he stealing?" Arthur asked, his expression remaining neutral. "Food," Ben muttered, his voice dropping slightly. "Some bread and peanut butter." "Was arrest the only option available to you in that moment?" Ben's face flushed hot, the warmth spreading down his neck. "He broke the law. That's what we do. Enforce the law." His words came out sharp and defensive. "Is enforcement always the best path to justice?" Arthur's question hung in the air like smoke. Could connecting him with social services have been more productive than putting him through the system? "So we just let people steal now?" Ben shot back, his voice rising to fill the silent room. His chair scraped against the floor as he leaned forward. "You're undermining everything I do in front of everyone. This is ridiculous." The room fell silent. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact with Ben entirely. The soft hum of the air conditioning seemed suddenly loud in the tension-filled space. "Questioning our actions isn't an attack, Officer Mathers," Arthur replied evenly, maintaining his composure. "It's how we grow. It's how we serve our community better." Ben noticed several officers nodding in agreement with Arthur. Some even murmured quiet words of support. The isolation hit him like a physical weight, settling heavy in his chest. These were his colleagues, people he'd worked with for years, and now they were pulling away, leaving him alone on his island of resistance. Later, sitting in his patrol car, Ben gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The leather creaked under his grip as he tried to steady his breathing. He wanted to dismiss Arthur's words, but they kept echoing in his head, impossible to ignore. The kid had only been trying to eat, just like Ben's own mother had sometimes struggled to put food on the table, working 2 jobs, but still coming up short at the end of some months. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds in Arthur's office as Ben reluctantly took his seat. His jaw was still clenched from the morning's workshop, hands fidgeting restlessly in his lap. The tension in his shoulders was visible even through his uniform, making the usually crisp fabric bunch awkwardly around his neck. "Thank you for coming, Ben," Arthur said, his tone gentler than Ben expected. The older man's calm demeanor seemed to fill the small office, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a living room than a deputy chief's workspace. "I'd like to discuss what happened this morning." "More criticism," Ben shot back, then immediately regretted his defensiveness. He stared down at the worn carpet, avoiding Arthur's steady gaze, noticing how the fibers were threadbare near the desk from years of nervous feet shuffling in this very spot. Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying Ben with patient eyes. His weathered hands folded carefully on the desk between them, dark skin marked with decades of experience. "Actually, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the workshop. What made you react so strongly?" Ben shifted uncomfortably, the chair creaking beneath him like an accusation. "Look, some of what you said made sense, okay? About the kid and the food. Maybe arrest wasn't the only option." He paused, struggling with the admission, his voice growing quieter, almost vulnerable. "But it feels like you're targeting me specifically. Why am I the only one in this mentorship program? Why me?" A small smile crossed Arthur's face, reaching his eyes and softening the wrinkles at their corners. "I chose you, Ben." "What?" Ben's head snapped up, genuine surprise replacing his defensive posture, his hands finally stilling in his lap. "I reviewed dozens of officer records before taking this position. Yours stood out." Arthur reached for a file on his desk, its edges worn from frequent handling, coffee stains marking the corner. "I saw concerning patterns, yes, but I also saw potential. The kind of potential that reminds me of myself at a younger age." Ben's brow furrowed, confusion evident in his expression. "What do you mean?" "When I was a young lawyer, I had my own biases to confront. A mentor saw through my defensive exterior and pushed me to examine my assumptions. It changed the trajectory of my career." Arthur's voice carried the weight of experience, rich with memory and tinged with gratitude. That program wasn't punishment. It was an opportunity, just like this one. Ben absorbed this information, his anger giving way to curiosity. The afternoon light softened around them as he considered Arthur's words, casting a warm glow that seemed to match the moment. So this isn't about making an example of me? Far from it, Arthur replied, leaning forward slightly, his presence both commanding and comforting. This is about growth, Ben, the same kind of growth I experienced. Though skepticism still lingered, Ben felt something shift inside him, a small crack in his defensive wall. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he left Arthur's office that afternoon with more questions than answers. But for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this mentorship wasn't the punishment he'd assumed it to be. The thought followed him down the hallway like a persistent shadow, unexpectedly hopeful, as the sound of his footsteps echoed against the precinct's worn linoleum floors. Ben sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by towering stacks of case files. The lamp cast a harsh yellow glow over the scattered papers as he methodically worked through each report, making notes in the margins with a mechanical pencil. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in his third straight hour of immersing himself in his past decisions, searching for patterns he might have missed. Reaching for another file from the tallest stack, he froze. His mother's name jumped off the page like a physical blow. Sarah Mathers. His hands trembled as he opened the worn folder, its edges soft from years of handling, memories flooding back of that terrible day when his world fell apart at the seams. "No," he whispered, scanning the document with increasingly frantic eyes. "This can't be right." There it was in black and white, the typewritten words stark against the yellowed paper. Advocate assigned to case, Arthur Coleman. The words blurred as tears welled in his eyes, hot and unwanted. Ben pushed back from the table violently, knocking over his coffee mug. Dark liquid spread across the files like an advancing tide, but he barely noticed, his mind reeling from the revelation. 25 years melted away in an instant. He was 12 again, watching his mother being led away in handcuffs, her head bowed in shame. The shame and anger felt as fresh as ever, burning in his chest like acid. His mother had stolen to keep food on their table, to keep the heat on during bitter winter nights when the temperature dropped below freezing. And Arthur, the man who now claimed to want to mentor him, who spoke about justice and understanding, had been there, involved in tearing his family apart. Son of a... Ben slammed his fist on the table, rattling the lamp. All this time, Arthur had known. Every conversation, every lesson about empathy and understanding, every seemingly heartfelt discussion about seeing beyond the surface of things, he'd known exactly who Ben was. The connection to his past had been deliberately hidden, making Ben feel like a pawn in some twisted game of moral redemption. Grabbing his keys and the dampened case file, Ben stormed out of his apartment, letting the door slam behind him. The night air, crisp and cool, did nothing to cool his rage as he climbed into his car. Memories kept hitting him in waves. The empty apartment after his mother left, the years bouncing between foster homes, the bone-deep loneliness that had shaped him into the man he'd become. Now he sat in the precinct parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white and ached. The case file lay accusingly on the passenger seat, its pages wrinkled from coffee and rough handling. His mother's face floated in his mind, her tears, her whispered apologies, her absence that had left such a gaping hole in his life that he'd never quite managed to fill. "Damn you, Arthur," he muttered through clenched teeth, reaching for the file with shaking hands. The anger churned in his stomach, mixing with confusion and betrayal until he felt physically sick. Everything about their mentorship suddenly felt like a cruel joke, a calculated manipulation. Had Arthur been laughing at him this whole time? Playing mind games while knowing he'd helped destroy Ben's childhood? Ben stared at the precinct building, its windows still lit despite the late hour, like dozens of judging eyes. Arthur would be in there, probably in his office on the second floor, unaware that his carefully constructed mentorship was about to implode in spectacular fashion. The office door crashed open, making the blinds rattle violently against the window, Ben stormed in, his face flushed with anger, and his uniform wrinkled from a long shift, clutching a weathered case file in his trembling hands. Arthur looked up from his desk, his calm expression flickering briefly as Ben slammed the file down between them, scattering a few loose papers. "You knew," Ben snarled, his voice raw with emotion. "This whole time you knew exactly who I was." Arthur glanced at the file, recognition dawning in his eyes. He folded his hands carefully on the desk, his gold wedding ring catching the afternoon light. "Yes, Ben, I knew." "You destroyed my family." Ben's voice cracked. "I was 12 years old when they took my mother away. Do you have any idea what that did to me? The foster homes, the loneliness, watching other kids with their mothers while mine was locked up. Every single birthday, every holiday, just empty spaces where she should have been." Tears threatened to spill from Ben's eyes, but he blinked them back furiously. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as memories flooded back. Christmas mornings alone, graduation day with an empty chair where his mother should have been, years of built-up anger and pain that had shaped him into the man he'd become. "Your mother came to me for help, Ben," Arthur said softly, his usual composure showing cracks of genuine emotion. His shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of old memories. "She was scared, desperate. She knew what she was doing wasn't sustainable. She wanted better for you." "She was trying to feed me," Ben shouted, his voice echoing off the office walls. "To keep us warm, and you convinced her to throw herself at the mercy of a system that didn't care about us. We were barely surviving, but at least we were together." Arthur stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Ben's face. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his features, highlighting the deep lines of concern etched there. "I encouraged her to take responsibility for her actions because I believed it was her best chance at rehabilitation, at building a better life for both of you. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that hurt the most." "A better life?" Ben laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and wounded. "Is that what you call growing up without a mother? Moving from home to home, never belonging anywhere?" "Your mother thanked me later, Ben," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years. "She told me that turning herself in, facing her actions, it gave her a chance to rebuild, to find a legitimate path forward. She never stopped thinking about you." "You're lying," Ben spat, though uncertainty flickered across his face like a shadow. "I wouldn't lie about this," Arthur replied, his voice heavy with sincerity. "She understood that continuing down that path would have led to worse consequences for both of you. She made her choice out of love." Ben shook his head violently, unwilling or unable to process Arthur's words. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, leaving the door wide open behind him. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Arthur sank back into his chair, looking at the case file with weary eyes. The weight of Ben's pain, carried for so many years, seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. He reached for the file, his fingers tracing the name Sarah Mathers as he watched Ben's retreating figure through the window, knowing this conversation was far from over. The bell above the diner door chimed as Ben stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and grilled onions washing over him. The evening crowd was thin, just a few regulars scattered among the red vinyl booths, their quiet conversations mixing with the clink of silverware. In the corner, an elderly black woman with silver-streaked hair and warm brown eyes looked up and waved. Ben's heart thumped as he recognized Carol Johnson. He hadn't seen her since his mother's funeral 5 years ago, though her face hadn't changed a bit. "Benjamin," Carol said warmly, standing to give him a quick hug, her embrace carrying the same maternal comfort he remembered from childhood. "You look just like your mama." Got her eyes, her smile too. Ben slid into the booth across from her, his hands fidgeting with a paper napkin, folding and unfolding the corners until they went soft. "Thanks for meeting me, Mrs. Johnson. I need to ask you about something." Carol's kind eyes studied his face, taking in the worry lines that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "This is about Arthur Coleman, isn't it?" Ben's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. I was there through all of it. Your mama's darkest days and her brightest moments, too." Carol's voice softened, heavy with memory. She was struggling so much back then, Ben. The addiction had such a hold on her. Some days I barely recognized my friend anymore. But Arthur, Ben started, his voice tight with old pain. Arthur Coleman saved her life, Carol interrupted gently but firmly. When she got caught stealing those prescriptions, she was at rock bottom. Arthur could have thrown the book at her, but instead, he saw someone who needed help, someone worth saving. Ben stared down at the table, his throat tight, fingers pressing hard against the laminated surface. He's the reason I grew up without her. Carol reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her touch weathered but strong. No, honey. He's the reason you got your mama back at all. He helped her get into treatment instead of prison. Visited her every week, helped her find work after rehab. She turned her whole life around because one person believed she could. She fought hard for that second chance. Reaching into her purse, Carol pulled out a worn envelope, its edges soft from years of handling. Your mama wrote this to Arthur during her recovery. She'd want you to read it. Been carrying it with me since she passed, waiting for the right time. With trembling fingers, Ben unfolded the letter. His mother's familiar handwriting filled the page, each word carefully formed as if she'd taken her time to make them perfect. Dear Arthur, I don't know how to thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The path you showed me wasn't easy, but it saved my life. My biggest regret is the time I lost with Ben, but I pray that he'll grow into a man who shows others the same compassion you showed me. He has such a good heart. I see it even when his anger tries to hide it. Thank you for helping me become someone he can be proud of. With gratitude, Sarah. Ben's vision blurred as he read the words, a lump forming in his throat. He looked up at Carol, who was watching him with gentle understanding, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your mama was so proud of you becoming an officer, she said softly, her voice full of emotion. She always said you had the power to make a real difference in people's lives. Said you'd be the kind of officer who'd change things for the better. Ben carefully folded the letter, his anger giving way to a deep ache of understanding. Everything Arthur had been trying to teach him suddenly carried the weight of his mother's hopes, her words bridging the gap between past and present with painful clarity. Sunlight streamed through Ben's apartment windows as he sat at his kitchen table, his mother's letter spread out before him. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he read the worn pages for what felt like the 100th time. The paper was soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded so many times. Dear Arthur, the letter began in his mother's familiar handwriting, each curve and loop bringing back memories of birthday cards and hastily scrawled notes in his lunchbox. I can't thank you enough for showing me there was another way. When you convinced me to turn myself in, I thought my life was over. But you were right. It was just beginning. Ben's throat tightened as he traced his finger over the words, feeling the slight indentations where his mother's pen had pressed into the paper. His mother went on to describe her journey through rehabilitation, her growing strength, and her deepest hopes for her son. The pages were dotted with tiny water stains. Tears, he realized, either hers while writing or his own from previous readings. My Ben has such a good heart, she had written, the words slightly smudged but still clear. I pray he grows into a man who helps others the way you helped me, who sees beyond surface judgments to find the humanity in everyone. Ben pushed back from the table and paced his small living room, memories flooding back. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the bare walls as he moved. He remembered visiting his mother in prison, the shame he'd felt when other kids asked where she was. That shame had hardened into anger over the years. Anger at her, at the system, at anyone who represented authority. He'd built walls around himself, brick by bitter brick. He stopped at the window, watching a family walk by on the sidewalk below. A young boy held his mother's hand, skipping along beside her, his backpack bouncing with each step. Ben's chest ached with a familiar emptiness, a void that seemed to grow deeper with each passing year. I've been so wrong, he whispered to himself, his breath fogging the window glass. His phone buzzed on the table, the harsh vibration cutting through his thoughts. Ben picked it up to find a voicemail from Arthur. His finger hovered over the play button for a moment before he pressed it, his hand trembling slightly. Officer Mathers. Arthur's steady voice came through the speaker, as calm and assured as ever. I know we have much to discuss. There's a precinct meeting this afternoon at 2. I'd appreciate your presence. We can talk afterward, if you're willing. Ben set the phone down and looked again at his mother's letter. The last lines caught his eye, words he'd read so many times they were burned into his memory. Arthur, you showed me that it's never too late to change course. That's the gift I want to give my son, the knowledge that redemption is always possible. He sank back into his chair, the weight of years of misplaced anger pressing down on him like a physical burden. The thought of facing Arthur made his stomach churn with shame, but his mother's words echoed in his mind, offering a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to change course after all. Maybe there was still time to become the man his mother had always believed he could be. The precinct conference room buzzed with tension as officers filed in, their chairs scraping against the linoleum floor. Ben slipped into a seat near the back, his mother's letter folded carefully in his pocket. Arthur stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. Change isn't comfortable, Arthur began, his voice steady and clear. But comfort has never been the goal of law enforcement. Our goal is justice, equal justice for all. Several senior officers shifted in their seats, their disapproval evident in crossed arms and tight expressions. Sergeant Miller, a 20-year veteran, raised his hand. With all due respect, sir. Miller's tone carried anything but respect. These reforms you're proposing, they'll make our jobs impossible. We can't second-guess every decision in the field. Arthur nodded, acknowledging the concern without accepting its premise. We're not asking for second-guessing, Sergeant. We're asking for first thinking, for consideration before action. Ben watched as Arthur handled each challenge with the same patient dignity he'd shown during their confrontations. No defensiveness, no anger, just calm conviction. More officers spoke up, their objections ranging from practical concerns to thinly veiled resistance to change. Officer Mathers, Arthur's voice cut through Ben's thoughts. You've been through the first phase of our mentorship program. Would you share your perspective with your colleagues? The room fell silent. Ben felt every eye turn to him, some curious, others skeptical. His hand touched the letter in his pocket, drawing strength from its presence. The program is... Ben paused, knowing his next words carried weight. It's challenging, he offered weakly, seeing disappointment flicker across Arthur's face. But necessary, he added quickly, the words falling flat in the quiet room. As murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd, Ben realized his tepid response had pleased neither side. He'd tried to walk a middle line and instead had undermined both Arthur's authority and his own integrity. The truth was more complicated, more personal, and he'd failed to honor that complexity with his half-hearted answer. The meeting continued, but Ben barely heard the rest of the discussion. He was too focused on the growing realization that real change, the kind his mother had achieved, the kind Arthur was trying to foster, required more than just showing up. It demanded complete commitment, even when that commitment meant facing uncomfortable truths about oneself. As officers began filing out after the meeting's end, Ben remained in his seat, watching Arthur gather his materials. He knew what he needed to do next, even if the prospect made his heart race. It was time for an honest conversation, not as an officer defending his record, but as a man ready to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. The evening sun cast long shadows through the blinds of Arthur's office as Ben stood at the doorway, his heart pounding. Arthur looked up from his desk, his expression neutral but welcoming. "Come in, Ben," Arthur said softly. Ben walked in slowly, pulling the worn letter from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out the creases. "I owe you an apology," Ben started, his voice thick with emotion. "I blamed you for years without knowing the whole story. I was wrong." Arthur leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "Take your time, Ben." "I found this yesterday," Ben said, extending the letter. "My mother wrote it to you during her rehabilitation. Carol Johnson gave it to me." Arthur gently took the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. A small smile crossed his face as he read, and Ben noticed his eyes grow misty. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," Arthur said after a moment. "She wanted so much more for you than the path she was on." Ben sank into the chair across from Arthur's desk. "I always thought you were the bad guy in our story, that you took her away from me. But she writes here about how you helped her find the strength to turn herself in to get clean." "It wasn't an easy decision," Arthur replied, carefully folding the letter. "But sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that matter most. I never wanted to hurt your family, Ben. I wanted to help your mother find her way back to you." Ben nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand that now, and I want to do better. As an officer, as a person. I'm ready to really commit to this mentorship program." Arthur studied Ben's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "It won't be easy. We have a lot of work to do addressing those biases you've carried for so long." "I know," Ben acknowledged, "but I'm ready to try." "Then we'll start fresh tomorrow," Arthur said, standing and extending his hand. "Rebuilding trust takes time, but the hardest step is always the first one." Ben stood and shook Arthur's hand firmly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since the mentorship began, he felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Ben sat at the microfiche reader in the dimly lit records office, his fingers carefully turning the dial. The morning light filtered through dusty windows as he scrolled through years of local newspapers. His mother's face appeared on the screen, and his breath caught in his throat. The headline read, "Former Inmate Leads Community Outreach Program." The photo showed his mother, Sarah Mathers, smiling broadly as she accepted a plaque. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her eyes sparkled with pride. Ben's vision blurred with tears. He printed the article with shaking hands, then dug deeper into the archives. Each discovery hit him like a punch to the gut. There she was, graduating from the local community college with honors. Another clipping showed her speaking at a youth center, sharing her story of redemption. "Can I help you find anything specific?" the librarian asked softly. Ben wiped his eyes quickly. "No, thank you, I've found what I needed." He pulled up more recent records. His mother had volunteered at the Second Chance Women's Shelter for over a decade. The shelter's annual report included a special mention of her dedication to helping other women rebuild their lives after incarceration. Then he found it, a photo that made his hands freeze on the controls. His mother stood surrounded by smiling women, receiving an award for outstanding community service. The caption noted her 15 years of dedication. The date hit him hard. It was just 2 years before she passed away. Ben stared at her face, seeing now what he'd refused to see before. This wasn't the woman he'd painted in his mind, the one who'd abandoned him. This was someone who'd fought to make things right, who'd turned her life around and helped others do the same. Tears fell freely now as he thought of all the years he'd spent angry, all the assumptions he'd made about others based on his distorted view of justice. The weight of his prejudices felt heavier than ever. He gathered the printouts with trembling hands, knowing he needed to share these discoveries with Arthur. Each piece of paper represented another crack in the wall of anger he'd built around himself. As Ben stood to leave, he paused at one last photo, his mother speaking at a police academy graduation. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been letting his bitterness shape him into exactly what she'd fought against, she'd been working to build bridges between law enforcement and the community. The bell above the diner door chimed as Ben and Arthur entered. The evening crowd was thin, just a few regulars nursing coffee cups at the counter. They settled into a worn leather booth near the window, where the setting sun cast long shadows across their table. Ben pulled out the folder he'd brought from the records office, his hands trembling slightly. "I found these today," he said, sliding the photocopied newspaper articles across the table. "I never knew. I thought after prison she just—" Arthur picked up the articles carefully, studying the photo of Sarah Mathers receiving her Community Service Award. His eyes softened with recognition. She was remarkable, Ben. The way she turned her life around, it wasn't just for show. She meant every bit of it. The waitress interrupted briefly to take their orders. Once she left, Ben leaned forward. "Did you know she went to community college?" "I did," Arthur nodded, stirring his coffee. "She studied social work. Said she wanted to help others avoid the mistakes she'd made. Your mother had a way of connecting with people who felt lost. Ben stared into his own coffee cup. I became a cop because I wanted control, he admitted quietly. After everything with Mom, I needed to feel like I could keep things from falling apart. That's understandable, Arthur said gently. But control isn't the same as justice or service. What do you think your role could be now? I don't know anymore, Ben replied honestly. Everything I thought I knew about Mom, about myself, it's all different now. Different doesn't mean worse, Arthur said. You have an opportunity here, Ben. Your experiences, both the pain and the healing, they could make you exactly the kind of officer this community needs. The waitress returned with their meals, but Ben barely noticed the plate in front of him. His mind was racing with possibilities he'd never considered before. As they finished their meal, Arthur spoke again. Your mother once told me her greatest hope was that you'd find your way to helping others. She believed in your capacity for good, even when you were just a boy. Ben felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back, nodding silently. As they prepared to leave, Arthur placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. Your story isn't finished yet. What matters is what you do from here. The afternoon sun filtered through the precinct's blinds, casting striped shadows across the conference room table. Ben sat beside Arthur, both of them surrounded by stacks of papers and photos from the Martinez case, an incident where Officer Thompson had allegedly used excessive force during a routine traffic stop. Let's review the sequence of events, Arthur said, spreading out the incident photos. His voice remained steady, methodical. What stands out to you, Officer Mathers? Ben leaned forward, studying the timestamps on the photographs. Something wasn't adding up. The officer's report says he gave 3 verbal warnings over 2 minutes, but he shuffled through the papers, pulling out the dashcam timestamps. The footage shows only 30 seconds between first contact and physical confrontation. Arthur nodded, his expression neutral but encouraging. Good catch. What else? The suspect's injuries? Ben hesitated, aware of the other officers watching from nearby desks. They don't match Thompson's description of events. He claimed the suspect was actively resisting, but these bruises suggest the person was stationary, probably already subdued. Lieutenant Rogers, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, approached their table. You trying to throw another officer under the bus, Mathers? Ben felt his old defensiveness rising but took a deep breath. No, sir. I'm following the evidence. The photos and timestamps tell a clear story, one that differs from the official report. Evidence can be interpreted different ways, Rogers pressed. Not in this case, Ben replied firmly, surprising himself with his conviction. The dashcam footage shows 30 seconds, not 2 minutes. The injury pattern suggests excessive force. These aren't interpretations, they're facts. Arthur remained silent, watching the exchange with interest as other officers gathered around. We protect our own, Rogers warned. No, Ben countered, his voice steady. We protect the truth. That's what serves both the department and the community. He gestured to the evidence spread before them. If we ignore clear violations, we're not protecting anyone. We're just perpetuating the problem. The room fell silent. Ben could feel his heart pounding but maintained eye contact with Rogers, who eventually stepped back with a grunt of disapproval. After the other officers dispersed, Arthur gathered the files together. Well done, Officer Mathers. You showed real integrity there. Ben nodded, still processing what had just happened. For the first time since starting the mentorship program, he felt genuinely proud of himself. Not for dominating a situation, but for standing up for what was right. The town hall buzzed with tension as Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside Arthur. Fluorescent lights illuminated a sea of faces, some angry, others wary, all waiting to be heard. The wooden podium at the front seemed to loom larger with each passing minute. We're here to listen, Arthur addressed the crowd, his deep voice carrying authority and compassion. Every story matters. Every experience counts. One by one, community members approached the microphone. A middle-aged woman described being pulled over for no apparent reason. A teenager recounted feeling targeted while walking home from school. Each story landed like a punch to Ben's gut, especially when he recognized faces from his own past encounters. "Officer Mathers," said an elderly man, pointing directly at Ben. "You detained my grandson last summer, made him sit on the curb for an hour while you searched his car. Found nothing, but the humiliation stayed." Ben's throat tightened. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into him. Arthur placed a steady hand on his shoulder, nodding encouragingly. After several more testimonies, Ben couldn't stay silent. His legs felt like lead as he stood and walked to the podium. The microphone squealed slightly as he adjusted it. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and started again. "I've been wrong. Many times. I let my biases control my actions. I treated people unfairly, and I'm deeply sorry for the pain I've caused." The room fell silent. Ben continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm telling you I'm committed to change, to being better, to earning back your trust, even if it takes years." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces softened while others remained skeptical. An elderly woman in the front row nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Ben's with cautious hope. Arthur stepped forward, standing beside Ben at the podium. "Change begins with acknowledgement," he said. "Officer Mathers has taken the first step. Now comes the hard work of turning words into actions." The evening air was crisp as Ben stood on Arthur's front porch, his hand hesitating before the doorbell. The modest two-story house, with its well-tended garden and warm porch light, seemed to welcome him despite his nervousness. Arthur opened the door with a gentle smile. "Come in, Ben," he said, leading him through a living room filled with family photos and law books. The house smelled of coffee and old wood, comfortable and lived in. In Arthur's study, a cardboard box sat on his desk. It wasn't large, but Ben's heart raced at the sight of it. Arthur placed a hand on the box, his expression softening. "I've kept these things safe for years, hoping someday they'd find their way to you." Ben's hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside, he found photographs of his mother he'd never seen before, her receiving a sobriety chip, standing proud in front of a community center, helping other women in recovery. Each image showed a side of her he'd never known existed. Then he found the letter, yellowed with age but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. His mother's familiar handwriting brought an instant lump to his throat. "My dearest Ben, I hope someday you'll read these words and understand. Every day I spend working to be better, I think of you. You're the reason I keep going, keep trying. I dream that one day you'll grow into a man who uses his strength to protect others, to make this world a little kinder. I see that potential in you, baby. I always have." Ben's vision blurred with tears. He had to stop reading, overwhelmed by emotions he'd buried for decades. Arthur sat quietly, giving him space to process. "She never stopped believing in you," Arthur said softly. "Even when things were at their hardest, she talked about your good heart." "I had no idea," Ben whispered, touching a photo of his mother helping serve at a shelter. "All these years, I thought." "She wanted to make you proud," Arthur explained. "Everything she did was working toward being the mother you deserved." Ben clutched the letter to his chest, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for keeping these, for preserving this part of her." Arthur nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your mother's hope was that you'd use your position to make positive change. That's a legacy worth carrying forward." The precinct conference room buzzed with anticipation as officers filed in for the morning meeting. Ben sat in the front row, his posture straight but relaxed, a stark contrast to the defensive slouch he'd carried just a month ago. Arthur stood at the podium, commanding attention with his usual quiet authority. "Today marks a new chapter for our precinct," Arthur began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We're launching a comprehensive mentorship program for our younger officers." Ben's heart raced as Arthur outlined the program's structure. Before he could second-guess himself, he raised his hand. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer as a co-leader. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Officer Martinez, a veteran of 15 years, scoffed audibly. You're kidding, right? Weren't you just on the other side of this a month ago? Ben stood, facing his colleagues. His hands were steady as he gripped the back of his chair. That's exactly why I should help lead this program. I know firsthand what it's like to resist change, to let pride and anger cloud judgment. He paused, meeting the skeptical gazes around him. Working with Deputy Chief Coleman showed me that being a good officer isn't about power or control. It's about service and growth. Pretty words, another officer called out. But how do we know this isn't just for show? Arthur stepped forward. I've witnessed Officer Mathers's transformation personally. His journey from resistance to understanding makes him uniquely qualified to guide others through this process. Several younger officers nodded in agreement. Officer Chen, a rookie who'd often sought Ben's advice recently, spoke up. I've seen the change in how Officer Mathers handles calls. He's different now, more patient, more understanding. Ben felt a surge of gratitude for the support, but he kept his voice level. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking for the chance to prove that change is possible, that we can be better officers and better people. Arthur smiled, pride evident in his expression. The program begins next week. Those interested in participating or mentoring can sign up after the meeting. As officers began discussing among themselves, Ben caught snippets of conversation, some doubtful, others curious, and a few genuinely enthusiastic. The challenge ahead was clear, but for the first time in his career, Ben felt ready to lead by example rather than force. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police precinct's courtyard, where rows of folding chairs were filled with a mix of officers in pressed uniforms and community members in their Sunday best. Colorful autumn leaves danced in the gentle breeze as Ben Mathers approached the podium, his hands steady but his heart racing. When Deputy Chief Coleman first pulled me into his mentorship program, I was angry, Ben began, his voice clear and strong. I thought I knew everything there was to know about being a good officer. I couldn't have been more wrong. The crowd sat in respectful silence as Ben continued, occasionally glancing at Arthur, who watched from his seat of honor with that familiar, calm smile. Arthur didn't just teach me about policing, he taught me about humanity. He showed me that true strength comes from admitting our mistakes and working to fix them. Ben paused, swallowing hard. He helped me understand that my own pain was driving decisions that hurt others, and he gave me the tools to break that cycle. Ben shared how the mentorship program had already begun transforming other officers, creating ripples of positive change throughout the precinct. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described watching younger officers learn the lessons that had taken him so long to grasp. When Arthur took the stage, his presence commanded the same quiet authority it always had. Officer Mathers represents what I've always believed about law enforcement, that with the right guidance and willingness to change, we can build bridges instead of walls. He turned to face Ben directly. Your transformation isn't just your own success story. It's a beacon of hope for everyone who believes in the power of redemption. The applause that followed was genuine and warm, filling the courtyard with a sense of possibility. As the ceremony drew to a close, Arthur approached Ben with the familiar box of his mother's belongings. I think it's time for you to be its keeper now, Arthur said softly, passing the box to Ben. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become. Ben accepted the box with trembling hands, understanding the weight of the legacy it represented. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Arthur's office, casting a warm glow on the nearly empty bookshelves. Ben knocked softly before entering, finding Arthur carefully packing his remaining belongings into cardboard boxes. Come in, Ben, Arthur said warmly, setting down a framed photograph. I was hoping you'd stop by. Ben ran his hand along the smooth wooden desk where he'd sat so many times during their mentorship sessions. I wanted to thank you properly, he said, his voice thick with emotion, not just for the ceremony yesterday, but for everything. Arthur smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. You did the hard work, Ben. I just showed you the door. We both know it was more than that, Ben replied. thinking of the box containing his mother's belongings. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Arthur leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. Speaking of seeing potential, have you considered taking on a larger role in reform efforts? Your experience could make a real difference beyond this precinct. Ben shifted uncomfortably. I don't know if I'm ready for that. The mentorship program is one thing, but leading bigger changes? He shook his head. That feels like too much. Remember how you felt when we first started? Arthur asked. You thought you couldn't change either, but look at you now. Officers who once doubted you are asking to join your training sessions. That's different, Ben protested. I had you guiding me every step of the way. Arthur's expression softened. And you've learned everything you need to guide others. Leadership isn't about having all the answers, Ben. It's about being willing to ask the right questions and listen to the answers. Ben fell quiet, considering Arthur's words. The morning light caught the silver in Arthur's hair, reminding Ben of how much wisdom and experience stood before him. You've already shown you can lead, Arthur continued. The way you handled the excessive force case, how you spoke up at the community forum, those weren't just moments of growth, they were moments of leadership. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as teenagers filled the plastic chairs arranged in a circle. Ben stood at the front, his police uniform replaced with casual clothes, a deliberate choice to make the youth feel more comfortable. Arthur sat quietly in the back, watching with quiet pride. I wasn't always the person standing before you today, Ben began, his voice steady but gentle. I used to be angry, at the world, at authority, at anyone who tried to help me. I thought I knew everything, but really, I was just scared. A few of the teenagers shifted in their seats, their attention caught by his honesty. One boy in particular, maybe 15, leaned forward slightly. I became a cop thinking it would give me control, Ben continued. Instead, it just showed me how much hurt I was carrying inside. Hurt that I was passing on to others without even realizing it. The 15-year-old raised his hand hesitantly. How did you stop being angry? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because sometimes it feels like that's all there is. Ben glanced briefly at Arthur before answering. I had help, he said. My mother, even when she wasn't there physically, left me a legacy of hope. And then this man right here, he gestured to Arthur, showed me that change was possible. He didn't just tell me, he proved it through his own actions. Arthur remained silent, watching as Ben connected with the youth in a way that felt authentic and powerful. This wasn't the same defensive officer who had pulled him over months ago. This was someone new, someone who had learned to turn his pain into purpose. The hardest part, Ben said, meeting the young man's eyes, was admitting that my anger wasn't protecting me. It was isolating me. It took someone believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself, to help me see that. The session continued, with more young people opening up, sharing their own struggles and fears. Ben listened intently, offering guidance without judgment, showing the same patience that Arthur had once shown him. As they walked to their cars afterward, Arthur placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. Today, you were the mentor, he said warmly. That's the legacy your mother hoped you'd build. Ben smiled, feeling both proud and humbled by the words. He understood now that true strength wasn't about control. It was about connection, about using your experiences to lift others up. That was the real power of mentorship, the lesson Arthur had been teaching him all along. Ben stood by the coffee maker, his hand frozen mid-pour as familiar voices drifted from the break room. Through the half-open door, he caught snippets of conversation that made his stomach tighten. Can you believe this touchy-feely nonsense? Officer Martinez scoffed. What's next? Group hugs before patrol? Laughter rippled through the room. Ben's jaw clenched as he recognized Officer Thompson's voice joining in. And Mathers? Acting all enlightened now. Talk about drinking the Kool-Aid. The coffee cup trembled slightly in Ben's hand. He set it down, his throat dry despite not having taken a sip. These were officers he'd worked with for years, people whose respect he'd once valued. Bet he's just kissing up to Coleman. another voice chimed in, playing the reformed bad boy to get ahead. The words hit Ben like a physical blow. Was that how they saw him? More importantly, was there any truth to it? He thought about the letter from his mother, tucked safely in his desk drawer, the pride in her words, her hope for the man he could become. Had he really changed, or was he just going through the motions? Taking a deep breath, Ben pushed open the door. The conversation died instantly, replaced by awkward shuffling and avoided gazes. "If you've got something to say about the program," Ben said, his voice steadier than he felt, "why don't you say it to my face?" Officer Martinez leaned back, arms crossed. "Come on, Mathers. We all know what this is. You're not fooling anyone with this sudden conversion. You think this is an act?" Ben stepped forward, heart pounding. "You think I wanted to admit I was wrong? That I enjoyed standing up in front of the community and owning up to my mistakes?" The room fell silent, but Ben could see the skepticism in their eyes. Doubt crept in, making him question every step of his journey. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just playing a role, telling people what they wanted to hear. But then he remembered Arthur's words. Change isn't about what others believe. It's about what you know to be true in your heart. Ben straightened his shoulders. "Mock the program all you want," he said, "but at least I'm trying to be better. When was the last time any of you did that?" He turned and walked out, leaving behind a stunned silence. His hands were shaking, but not from anger. For the first time, he realized that defending his transformation meant more than just facing external criticism. It meant truly believing in it himself. Ben stood at the front of the precinct meeting room, his heart pounding against his ribs. The fluorescent lights felt harsh as he surveyed the faces before him, some friendly, others openly hostile. Arthur sat quietly in the back, his presence reassuring but deliberately distant. "I know what some of you have been saying about the mentorship program," Ben began, his voice steadier than he felt. "And about me. I want to address that head on." He paused, letting the tension settle. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "6 months ago, I was probably your biggest critic. I thought this program was just political correctness gone wild. I fought it every step of the way." Ben's hands gripped the podium. "I was wrong." The room fell silent. Even the usual whispers and rustling of papers ceased. "I had to face some ugly truths about myself," Ben continued. "About how my personal biases affected my work, how my anger shaped my decisions. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to quit, to go back to believing I was always right." He glanced at Arthur, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "This program didn't just change how I police, it changed how I see myself and others. I learned that my mother, who I'd written off as just another criminal, had worked hard to turn her life around. I learned that my assumptions about people, about situations, were often wrong." Several officers who had been vocal critics sat up straighter, their expressions softening. "I'm not asking you to believe in me," Ben said. "I'm asking you to believe in the possibility of change. Because if someone as stubborn as me can learn and grow, anyone can." Arthur stood up. "Officer Mathers demonstrates exactly what this program aims to achieve. Not just better policing, but better understanding of ourselves and our community." To Ben's surprise, Officer Rodriguez, one of his harshest critics, raised his hand. "How do we get involved in the program?" Two other officers nodded, showing interest. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from skepticism to cautious curiosity. Ben felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He hadn't convinced everyone. Some still wore expressions of doubt, but he'd cracked open a door that had seemed sealed shut. His vulnerability hadn't weakened his position. It had strengthened it. Ben sat at his kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The evening light cast long shadows across the scattered papers of case files he'd been reviewing. His phone buzzed, displaying an unfamiliar number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Hello? Ben? It's Sarah, your sister." His hand tightened around the phone. It had been nearly 5 years since they'd last spoken, shortly after their mother's funeral. "Sarah?" His voice came out rough. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." I know. I saw the article in the Herald about the police mentorship program, about your work with Deputy Chief Coleman. There was a pause. It made me think about Mom. Ben's eyes drifted to the box of his mother's belongings that Arthur had given him, sitting on his coffee table. Yeah, a lot's changed. I can tell. Sarah's voice softened. You sound different, more like the brother I remember from when we were kids. Ben swallowed hard. I've learned a lot about Mom recently, about what she went through, what she accomplished after. Everything. Arthur Coleman, he helped her, didn't he? He did. I didn't understand it then. I was so angry I couldn't see that he was trying to help our family. We both carried that anger for a long time, Sarah said quietly. But reading about your work, how you're helping others now, Mom would be proud, Ben. Ben felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. I'd like to tell you about it, about everything I've learned. Maybe we could meet somewhere? I'd like that. Sarah's voice wavered slightly. It won't be easy, but I miss my brother. I miss you too, sis. Baby steps? Baby steps, she agreed. They made tentative plans to meet at a cafe the following weekend. After hanging up, Ben sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, feeling both terrified and hopeful about rebuilding this broken bridge from his past. Ben stood at the park entrance, his hands fidgeting with the worn envelope containing his mother's letter. The spring afternoon was perfect. Warm sunshine, gentle breeze, and the sound of children playing in the distance. His heart raced as he spotted Sarah approaching with 2 small children in tow. "Uncle Ben!" the kids shouted, though they only knew him from photos. Their enthusiasm caught him off guard, bringing an unexpected smile to his face. Sarah hung back slightly, her eyes glistening. "Hey, big brother." They embraced awkwardly at first, but the tension melted as her children, Tommy and Emma, tugged at Ben's jacket, eager to show him their playground abilities. "Watch me on the monkey bars," Tommy called out, racing ahead. Ben and Sarah settled on a nearby bench watching the kids play. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," they both said simultaneously, then laughed softly. "I found something," Ben said, carefully removing the letter from his pocket. "It's from Mom. She wrote it while she was in recovery." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the letter. As she read, tears rolled down her cheeks. She never stopped believing in us, did she? Even when we stopped believing in each other. Ben put his arm around his sister's shoulders. She saw the best in everyone. I'm just starting to understand that now. Tommy and Emma's laughter rang out across the playground, a reminder of joy and new beginnings. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled. "The kids ask about you all the time," she said. "They'd love to see more of their uncle." "I'd like that," Ben replied, watching his niece attempt a cartwheel. "Maybe we could make this a regular thing? Sunday afternoons in the park?" Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand. "I think Mom would have loved that." They spent the next hour watching the children play, sharing memories of their mother, and carefully beginning to bridge the gap years of silence had created. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the playground as Tommy and Emma took turns showing Ben their favorite games. Looking at his sister's smile and hearing his niece and nephew's laughter, Ben felt something shift inside him. A wound beginning to heal, a family starting to mend. Ben sat across from Arthur in the familiar office, surrounded by the warm afternoon light filtering through the windows. The space held countless memories of their challenging conversations and breakthrough moments over the past month. Arthur's expression was gentle but serious as he folded his hands on the desk. "I have something important to tell you, Ben," Arthur said, his voice steady. "I'll be retiring at the end of next month." Ben felt his stomach drop. "Retiring? But the program is just getting started. We need you here." Arthur smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "The program is flourishing because of officers like you who've embraced change. That was always my goal, to plant the seeds and watch them grow." "I don't know if I'm ready," Ben admitted, his voice tight with emotion. "There's still so much I need to learn from you." "You've already learned the most important lessons," Arthur said, leaning forward. "You've faced your biases, confronted your past, and chosen to grow. I've watched you transform from someone who resisted change to someone who champions it. Ben shook his head, doubt creeping into his voice. But what if I make mistakes? What if I can't maintain what we've built? Of course you'll make mistakes, Arthur chuckled warmly. That's part of leadership. But you've developed something more valuable than perfection, the ability to learn from those mistakes and keep moving forward. You believed in me when no one else did, Ben said quietly. Even when I fought against everything you were trying to teach me. Arthur's eyes softened with pride. You don't need me to tell you what to do anymore. You've already proven that you know the way forward. Your actions with the younger officers, your honesty with the community, these aren't things I'm making you do. They're choices you're making because you understand their importance. Ben felt tears threatening to form but held them back. I promise to continue what you started, to lead with the same integrity and compassion you've shown me. That's all I could hope for, Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. But remember, you're not just continuing my legacy, you're building your own. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on their journey from that first tense traffic stop to this moment of transition. Ben realized that while Arthur's guidance had been crucial, his mentor had also given him something more valuable, the confidence to trust his own judgment and the courage to stand up for what was right. You've already proven that you know the way forward, Arthur repeated softly. Now it's time to show others the path. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as Ben stood at the podium, facing a diverse crowd of officers and community leaders. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the determined expressions of those gathered. Arthur Coleman sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of how far they'd come. Ben cleared his throat, his voice steady and confident. 3 months ago, we started something small, a mentorship program built on trust and accountability. Today, we're expanding that vision. He gestured to the presentation screen behind him, which displayed photos from various community outreach events. I stand before you as living proof that change is possible. Many of you knew me as a different officer, one ruled by biases and anger. But through mentorship and honest self-reflection, I learned that true strength comes from empathy and understanding. The room fell silent as Ben shared personal stories of his transformation. He spoke about his mother's letter, his reconnection with his sister, and the countless moments where Arthur's guidance had challenged him to grow. This expanded program isn't just about officer training, Ben continued, his voice growing passionate. It's about building bridges between law enforcement and the community we serve. Each officer will be paired not only with a senior mentor but also with community leaders who can share their perspectives and experiences. Several officers nodded in agreement, while community members exchanged hopeful glances. Ben outlined the program's new initiatives, regular town halls, joint training sessions, and collaborative outreach events. Change doesn't happen overnight, Ben acknowledged, but it starts with being willing to listen, to learn, and to grow. I'm living proof that transformation is possible when we open ourselves to honest feedback and genuine connection. As Ben concluded his presentation, the room erupted in applause. Officers and community leaders alike approached the podium, eager to sign up for the program. Arthur watched from his seat, beaming with pride as Ben fielded questions and engaged with participants. After the crowd dispersed, Arthur made his way to Ben. Their handshake was warm and familiar, a gesture that carried the weight of their shared journey. "You've turned this into something I could only dream of," Arthur said, his eyes bright with emotion. The precinct courtyard was transformed for the celebration, with rows of chairs facing a small stage adorned with flowers. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the gathered crowd, a mix of officers, community members, and families. Ben's sister sat in the front row, her children fidgeting excitedly beside her. Ben stood at the podium, his hands steady as he adjusted the microphone. Looking out at the familiar faces, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. 6 months ago, I stood here talking about change, Ben began, his voice clear and strong. But today, I want to talk about legacy. Arthur Coleman didn't just teach me how to be a better officer. He showed me how to be the person my mother always believed I could become. He paused, glancing at Arthur, who sat with dignified composure despite the emotion in his eyes. When I first met Arthur, I was angry and defensive. I saw the world through a lens of bias and resentment. But through his patience and wisdom, I learned that true strength comes from facing our mistakes and choosing to grow from them. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out his mother's letter. My mother once wrote that she hoped I would use my strength for good. Thanks to Arthur's guidance, I finally understand what she meant. Arthur approached the podium, carrying a familiar box. As he handed it to Ben, their eyes met with mutual understanding. Inside were the treasured remnants of his mother's journey, her certificates, photos, and personal writings. "This box represents more than memories," Arthur said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "It represents hope, redemption, and the power of believing in someone's potential. Ben has proven that change is possible when we choose to embrace it." Community members stood to share their stories, tales of how the mentorship program had built bridges between law enforcement and neighborhoods, how officers had learned to serve with greater empathy and understanding. Each story added to the tapestry of transformation that Ben and Arthur had begun weaving months ago. Looking out at the audience, Ben saw the living proof of their work. Officers sitting shoulder to shoulder with community activists, his sister beaming proudly, young recruits eager to learn. The courtyard was filled with more than just people. It was filled with possibility. If you enjoyed the story of Arthur, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.